If you're running Windows 11 right now, there's a very good chance you're running a version called 24.8.2, and that version has an expiration date, October 13th, 2026. After that date, no more security patches, no more bug fixes, no more official support of any kind for the exact build of Windows running on what is almost certainly the single most common Windows 11 configuration on the planet. And here's the part that makes this story genuinely worth paying attention to, rather than just another routine end-of-life date buried in a Microsoft support document. Microsoft isn't waiting until October to deal with this. It's already quietly changing machines right now, in the background, without most people realizing it's happening. Not through a dramatic announcement, not through a countdown timer, but through the ordinary, unremarkable channel of Windows Update. The same mechanism most people have learned to click through without reading, because it's delivered small, routine patches for years, without much drama attached to any of them. That's actually part of what makes this particular story worth 15 minutes of your attention. It's not a scary manufactured deadline designed to panic you into clicking a video. It's a real, documented, verifiable date sitting on Microsoft's own official lifecycle page, paired with a real, currently in progress rollout that a meaningful number of people watching this video are probably already caught up in, whether they've noticed it or not. Let's start with why 24.8.2 specifically matters so much, because not every version of Windows reaching end of servicing is a big deal. Windows 11 24H2 has been the default installation on every single new Windows 11 PC sold since October of 2024. That's nearly 2 full years of new computers. Laptops bought as gifts, machines issued to new employees, replacement PCs bought after an old one finally gave out, all defaulting to this exact build. When you combine that with the huge number of existing Windows 11 machines that have simply updated forward into 24.8.2 over the past 2 years through normal Windows update cycles, you're looking at a version of Windows that plausibly represents the single largest share of the entire Windows 11 installed base worldwide. Think about the sheer diversity of machines that fall into that category. A college student's laptop bought last year for coursework, a small retail shop's point-of-sale terminal, a home office desktop someone assembled from parts, a hand-me-down machine passed from a parent to a teenager. None of these people necessarily think of themselves as running anything specific or noteworthy. They just think of themselves as having a Windows computer. But underneath that ordinary, unremarkable framing, an enormous share of them are running the exact build sitting at the center of this story. So when Microsoft's official lifecycle page says Windows 11 version 24.8.2 for Home and Pro editions reaches end of servicing on October 13th, 2026, that's not a footnote affecting some obscure, rarely used edition. That's a date that touches an enormous mainstream slice of the computers people are actually using every single day right now to do their jobs, manage their finances, and keep in touch with their families. It's worth pausing on what end of servicing actually means in practical terms, because the phrase itself can sound more abstract than the reality actually is. It does not mean your computer stops working the moment the date passes. Your files stay exactly where they are. Your applications keep launching. The machine keeps booting up every morning exactly the way it did the day before. What actually changes is quieter and in some ways more concerning precisely because it's invisible. Microsoft stops shipping security patches, stops shipping bug fixes, and stops providing technical support for that specific build. Any vulnerability discovered in that version of Windows after October 13th simply never gets patched for machines still running. Unless those machines get moved onto a newer, currently supported version first. That's a genuinely different kind of risk than a dramatic, headline-grabbing lockdown. Nothing forces you out, nothing shuts down. The computer simply becomes progressively less safe to use over time as newly discovered vulnerabilities pile up unaddressed while everything about the day-to-day experience of using the machine looks and feels completely unchanged. That gap between how safe a machine feels and how safe it actually is exactly the kind of risk that's easy for an ordinary person to underestimate because there's no visible signal telling you anything has actually changed. It helps to think about this the way security researchers actually think about it, rather than the way headlines tend to frame it. A newly discovered vulnerability in a currently supported operating system gets a patch, usually within weeks, sometimes faster for anything considered critical. That same vulnerability, discovered in an operating system past its servicing date, simply sits there, permanently unaddressed, available to anyone who figures out how to exploit it, for as long as that machine keeps running that unsupported version. The vulnerability doesn't become more dangerous the day support ends, it becomes permanently unfixed from that day forward, which over months and years adds up to a meaningfully larger attack surface than most casual users intuitively appreciate. Now here's where this story gets genuinely interesting, and where the Microsoft isn't waiting part of this title actually comes from. Rather than simply letting the October deadline arrive and dealing with the fallout after the fact, Microsoft has already started actively automatically moving eligible Home and Pro Edition PCs from 24H2 onto the next version, 25H2, well ahead of that date. This isn't a manual update you have to go looking for in Windows Update and click download on. On many machines, this is happening as what's effectively a forced push. Microsoft moving your operating system version forward on its own schedule, not necessarily yours. And here's a detail that genuinely surprised a lot of people once it got wider attention. The actual mechanics of this update are, in a sense, deceptively small. Windows 11 at 24H2, 25H2, and even the next version after that, 26H2, all run on the exact same underlying platform, which Microsoft has internally codenamed Germanium. Because of that shared foundation, moving a machine from 24H2 to 25H2 isn't a massive hours-long operating system overhaul, the way past major Windows version jumps have sometimes been. According to reporting on this rollout, the actual update process takes just minutes, requiring a single reboot, specifically because so much of the underlying system architecture is already identical between these versions. Microsoft is essentially able to flip a switch that changes your official version number and servicing timeline without the kind of dramatic, all-day reinstallation process people might expect from a major Windows upgrade. That's worth sitting with for a second because it reveals something important about what a Windows version number actually represents at this point. For a lot of Windows history, moving between major versions meant genuinely significant changes under the hood. New features, redesigned interfaces, substantial architectural shifts. With 24H2, 25H2, and 26H2 all sharing the Germanium platform, the version number increasingly functions more like a servicing checkpoint than a description of a fundamentally different operating system. Microsoft can extend your support clock forward by pushing what amounts to a fairly light, fast update, rather than something that would traditionally be considered a full upgrade. This shift in approach is actually a meaningful change in how Microsoft manages its own product lifecycle compared to a decade ago. In the past, a major version transition, think Windows 7 to Windows 8 or Windows 8 to Windows 10, genuinely felt like getting a new operating system, complete with a very different interface, new default applications, and a learning curve for anyone used to the old way of doing things. The Germanium approach effectively decouples the feels like a new OS experience from the gets a new support clock mechanism entirely. You can be running what officially counts as a different, currently supported version of Windows, with an entirely fresh 2-year servicing window attached to it, while the actual day-to-day experience of using your computer looks and feels almost identical to what you had the day before. That's efficient from Microsoft's perspective and arguably good for users in terms of minimizing disruption, but it also means the traditional signal people use to rely on, this feels like a completely different Windows, so I know something big changed, no longer reliably tells you anything about where you actually stand in the support lifecycle. If you want to check exactly where your own machine stands in all of this, there's a simple way to do it. Press the Windows key and R together to open the Run dialog. Type WinVer and press Enter. That'll pop up a small window telling you exactly which version and build number your PC is currently running. If you see 24H2 sitting there, you're on the version with the October 13th deadline attached to it. And depending on how Microsoft's rollout schedule is proceeding on your specific machine, you may already be a candidate for that automatic move to 25H2, whether you've explicitly requested it or not. This takes under a minute, requires no technical background whatsoever, and gives you a concrete, verifiable answer instead of a guess, which is exactly the kind of small, low-effort action that this entire story is really about. Let's talk about who's actually protected from this timeline, and who isn't, because the picture isn't uniform across every type of Windows 11 user. Home and Pro Edition users are the ones facing the October 13th, 2026 cutoff directly. Enterprise and Education editions get meaningfully more breathing room. Those editions don't hit their own end of servicing until October of 2027, a full year later. That gap exists because large organizations running enterprise or education licensing typically have far more complex deployment processes, more legacy software dependencies, and more centralized IT oversight, managing their update cycles. So Microsoft has historically built in longer transition windows for those editions to account for that added complexity. But here's the thing worth understanding about that distinction. Most individual consumers, most small businesses, most home offices, and most freelancers are running home or pro editions, not enterprise or education. The longer runway exists specifically for large, centrally managed organizations, not for the ordinary person reading a Windows Update notification on their personal laptop, or the small business owner who bought a handful of standard consumer-grade machines for their office rather than negotiating an enterprise licensing agreement. It's worth being specific about how to tell which edition you're actually running, since the distinction matters directly to which deadline applies to you. That same WinVer command shows your version number, but checking your specific edition requires a slightly different path. Going into Settings, then System, then About will show you clearly whether your machine is running Home, Pro, Enterprise, or Education. For the overwhelming majority of people watching this who bought a personal laptop or desktop from a retail store or who work at a small business that didn't specifically negotiate volume licensing with Microsoft, Home or Pro is almost certainly what you'll find listed there, which means the October 2026 date, not the more forgiving 2027 date, is the one that actually applies to your situation. Checking this now, before the deadline arrives, costs you nothing and tells you definitively which timeline you're actually working with, rather than assuming and potentially getting it wrong in either direction. Windows 11, 24H2 isn't actually standing alone here either. It's part of a much larger wave of Microsoft products all reaching end of life within the same calendar year, and understanding that broader context helps explain why 2026 specifically has become such a significant year for Microsoft's product lifecycle decisions. Office 2021 reaches its own end of support this year. SQL Server 2016 does as well. Windows Server 2012 is finishing out its very last year of extended security updates, the paid program that lets organizations keep receiving critical security patches for a limited time after a product's official end-of-life date. Compare that to 2025, which was largely dominated by a single enormous story, Windows 10 itself reaching end of support. And 2026 looks less like an isolated event and more like Microsoft clearing out a substantial backlog of products all at once, a genuine pileup of expiring software across its entire lineup, not just a single deadline attached to Windows 11 in isolation. It's worth understanding why so many deadlines are landing in the same window, rather than assuming it's simple coincidence. Microsoft has historically staggered major product releases across several years, which means their standard support windows, typically running somewhere in the range of 5 to 10 years depending on the product category, naturally cluster around whatever release cadence the company followed a decade or so earlier. A wave of products originally launched in a similar time frame tends to produce a corresponding wave of expiration dates landing close together years later, purely as a function of how the original release schedule was staggered, rather than any deliberate decision to expire everything at once. Understanding that mechanical explanation doesn't make the practical impact any smaller for the people and organizations affected, but it does explain why 2026 specifically looks like such a concentrated pileup compared to quieter years. It's worth being clear about what an extended security updates program actually offers, since it comes up as an option for some of these expiring products, and people often misunderstand its scope. ESU, where it's available, covers critical security fixes only. Nothing else. No new features, no general bug fixes, no functional improvements, just a narrow safety net specifically for the most serious vulnerabilities, and typically only for a limited additional window, often at a real financial cost to the organization or individual choosing to enroll. It's a genuine option worth knowing about if you're managing older infrastructure that can't be upgraded immediately, but it's not a substitute for actually moving to a currently supported version, and it's rarely something offered to individual consumers the way it is to large enterprise customers. It's also worth understanding why an extended security updates program specifically exists as a concept, rather than Microsoft simply extending free support indefinitely for everyone who wants it. Maintaining security patches for an aging operating system requires ongoing, dedicated engineering resources, testing fixes against increasingly outdated hardware and software, combinations, maintaining specialized knowledge of an older codebase that most engineers have long since moved past, and doing all of that for a shrinking population of users while newer versions absorb the bulk of ongoing development attention. ESU exists as a paid compromise specifically for organizations that genuinely cannot migrate on the standard timeline, not as a permanent alternative to eventually moving forward. Now, why does any of this matter more urgently for a database sitting behind a company's firewall than for someone's personal note-taking app? That distinction is actually a useful way to think about the real stakes here. If a lightweight note-taking app on your personal machine falls out of active support, the practical risk to you is genuinely low. It's a small, self-contained piece of software with limited access to sensitive systems. But an entire operating system reaching end of servicing is a fundamentally different category of exposure. Windows sits underneath everything else running on your machine. Your browser, your email client, your banking app, every piece of software you use touches the operating system at some level. An unpatched vulnerability at that. Foundational layer isn't contained to one small app. It's a potential doorway into anything else running on that same machine. That's exactly why an expiring database server behind a corporate firewall is treated as a serious operational risk, deserving real budget and planning, while an expiring note-taking app mostly isn't, and it's why an entire consumer operating system reaching end of servicing deserves more attention than most people currently give it. This layered risk is also why security professionals talk about attack surface as a specific, meaningful concept rather than just a vague warning phrase. Every piece of software running on your machine represents a potential entry point, but not all entry points carry equal weight. A vulnerability in the operating system itself sits underneath every single application you run, meaning a successful exploit there can potentially grant access to everything else on the machine simultaneously, rather than being contained to whatever one app happened to have the flaw. That's the specific reason operating system end-of-life dates get treated with more institutional seriousness in enterprise security planning than the end-of-life date of almost any individual application running on top of it. And it's a distinction worth carrying into how you think about your own personal machine, not just a corporate server room. Let's also talk honestly about the recent track record of Windows 11 updates themselves, because it adds an important layer of context to why Microsoft isn't waiting, carries a bit of a double meaning in this story. This past January, Microsoft's very first Windows 11 security update of 2026 went wrong almost immediately after release. The update caused shutdown and hibernation failures on a set of machines running Windows 11 23H2, specifically Enterprise and IoT editions with a security feature called Secure Launch Enabled, meaning affected PCs simply wouldn't properly power down or go into hibernation. An obviously disruptive problem for anyone relying on their machine to actually turn off when they tell it to. The same update separately triggered remote desktop connection and authentication failures, reaching well beyond just those affected. Additions, hitting multiple different Windows versions at once. Microsoft's response to this was to issue what's called an out-of-band update, a patch released completely outside the normal, predictable monthly update cycle, specifically because the problem was serious enough that waiting for the next scheduled update window wasn't an acceptable option. That emergency fix went out on January 17th. Barely 10 days later, Microsoft had to roll out a second emergency update entirely, this time addressing a different set of problems introduced by that same original January patch. The classic Outlook desktop app breaking entirely for a large number of users, sleep mode failures on certain hardware, configurations, and a bug that reset people's desktop backgrounds if they'd customized their file explorer using certain configuration files. 2 emergency unscheduled patches inside of roughly 2 weeks, all stemming from a single security update that was originally meant to fix problems, not create new ones. It's worth understanding why out-of-band updates specifically are treated as such a significant signal within Microsoft's own release process. The company's standard cadence revolves around a predictable monthly cycle, commonly referred to as Patch Tuesday, which gives IT departments, system administrators, and even careful individual users a reliable rhythm to plan around. You generally know roughly when updates are coming, giving you time to prepare, test, and back up if needed. An out-of-band release breaks that entire rhythm deliberately, which Microsoft only does when a problem is judged serious enough that the normal predictable cadence isn't fast enough to address it responsibly. Needing to break that rhythm twice within the same month, for 2 different sets of problems stemming from the same original patch, is a genuinely unusual pattern, even accounting for the fact that any software company managing an operating system at this scale will occasionally need an emergency fix. That track record matters directly to the story we're covering here, because it's the same company, running the same update infrastructure, that's currently pushing an automatic version change across a huge share of the world's Windows 11 machines ahead of the October deadline. None of this means the 24H2 to 25H2 transition itself is guaranteed to go badly. Most routine Windows updates, including plenty of version transitions, do proceed smoothly for the overwhelming majority of users without incident. But given how recently Microsoft was dealing with 2 consecutive emergency patches in the same year, it's reasonable to go into this particular transition with your eyes open, rather than assuming every automatic Windows update in 2026 is guaranteed to be a smooth, invisible process. So what should you actually do with all of this information if you're someone running Windows 11 24H2 right now? The most useful, concrete first step is simply checking your current version using that winver command we walked through earlier, so you know exactly where you stand rather than guessing. If you're already showing as 25H2, you've effectively already been moved forward, whether you noticed it happening or not, and your servicing clock has been extended along with it. If you're still showing 24H2, it's worth proactively checking Windows Update yourself in Settings under Windows Update, rather than simply waiting for Microsoft's automatic rollout schedule to reach your specific machine on its own timeline. Taking the update on your own terms, at a time that's convenient for you, backed up with nothing important left unsaved, is a meaningfully better position to be in than having an update triggered automatically in the background at some point Microsoft chooses instead of you. It's also worth doing a basic backup of anything genuinely irreplaceable before any significant Windows update, not because this specific transition is expected to go badly, but because that's simply sound practice before any operating system change, given the emergency patch history we just walked through. An external drive, a cloud backup service, even just copying your most important documents and photos to a second location, none of that requires deep technical expertise, and all of it meaningfully reduces your exposure if something does go wrong during an update, whether that update happens on your schedule or Microsoft's. If you're managing multiple machines, for a small business, a family with several computers, a nonprofit running on a tight IT budget, it's worth taking a few minutes to check the actual Windows version across all of them rather than assuming they're all in the same state. It's common for a mixed fleet of machines, bought at different times, to be sitting on different Windows versions entirely, some already on 25H2, others still on 24H2, some even further behind depending on how consistently updates have been applied. Knowing exactly where each machine stands lets you make a deliberate decision about timing, rather than discovering after the fact that some of your machines quietly aged out of support months before you realized it. It's worth thinking through a specific practical scenario to make this concrete. Imagine a small business running 8 machines across. A front office and a back office bought over the course of 3 separate years as budget allowed. Without ever specifically checking, it's entirely plausible that some of those machines are running 25H2 already, some are still on 24H2 and haven't yet received Microsoft's automatic push, and one older machine in the back office might still be sitting on an even earlier version nobody's gotten around to updating at all. A 10-minute audit, walking to each machine, pressing Windows key plus R, typing WinVer, and jotting down what comes up, turns that uncertainty into a clear, actionable list. Which machines are already fine, which need an update soon, and which need immediate attention before October arrives. That's a small amount of effort that meaningfully reduces the odds of an unpleasant surprise landing on exactly the wrong day. Here's the bigger pattern I think is actually worth sitting with as we wrap this up, because it goes beyond just this one specific deadline. Windows 11 24H2's end of servicing isn't really an isolated event. It's part of an increasingly routine, recurring cycle where Microsoft ships a security update. That update sometimes introduces serious new problems. An emergency out-of-band patch follows. Within days or weeks, and underneath all of that, entire product life cycles keep marching forward on their own predetermined schedule, regardless of how smoothly or roughly any individual update along the way actually goes. That's not really a story about any one bad patch or any one deadline. It's a story about the sheer scale and complexity of maintaining an operating system running on hundreds of millions of wildly different hardware configurations worldwide, where routine maintenance increasingly means keeping pace with a moving target that doesn't slow down to wait for things to go smoothly first. It's also a useful lens for thinking about every other product on that broader 2026 expiration list we touched on earlier. Office 2021, SQL Server 2016, Windows Server 2012's final year of extended security updates. Each of those has its own version of this exact same dynamic playing out. A real documented deadline, a real population of users still relying on the older version, and a real gap between how urgent the situation actually is and how urgent it feels from the outside, precisely because none of it comes wrapped in a dramatic countdown timer or a final warning framing. The actual risk in stories like this tends to be quieter, more procedural, and considerably more boring than the version of this story a fear-driven headline would tell you. But boring and real is a much better place to make decisions from than exciting and fabricated. I want to know where you actually stand on this. Did you already know your machine was on 24H2, or is this the first time you're checking? If you've already been moved onto 25H2 without actively choosing to update, tell me in the comments whether you even noticed it happening, or whether you only found out by watching this video and running WinVer yourself just now. I think that gap between what's technically happening to your machine and what you actually perceive happening is really the most interesting part of this whole story, and I'd like to hear how wide that gap actually turned out to be for people watching this. If you want more honest, grounded breakdowns of what's actually happening with Windows updates, deadlines, and lifecycle changes, without the manufactured urgency and fake countdowns that tend to circulate around stories like this one, subscribe. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll keep tracking these real deadlines as they actually unfold, rather than inventing new ones.